Hi, welcome to the April 2018 Software Cooperative. We are going to be talking about organic cross-training this month. We have a white paper up on the meetup, and I'm going to pass it over to Watson to get started.
Thanks a lot. I'm going to go ahead and share the PDF here. All right. So organic cross-training. This paper was gathered from the information in this paper was gathered from 3 different books. The Continuous Delivery book, the Making Work Visible book, and another book called CrossFunctional Teams. This is also an extension of the meetup that we did last month, where we reviewed Making Work Visible, and I saw, and some other people saw, a bunch of some things that were kind of related to cross training, and I know we've been running into situations where we would like to cross train more, or we already are, and we just don't call it that. And so that Making Work Visible book kind of inspired this paper. So let's see here. So I'm going to go ahead and just read this first paragraph. When is cross training appropriate and desired? And what are the conditions that make cross training necessary? And should cross training be formal or informal? These are some of the questions that we're going to try to answer in this paper, and then kind of have some type of debate about cross training in general. Some of the things for our group and for this meetup, we're really interested in self-organized groups and how cross training can occur within the self-organized group. Self-organized groups have unique issues or challenges where there has to be maybe some type of majority or consensus around the direction where they want to go, and cross training can kind of seem like a time sink sometimes. So that joint recognition is very important in order to actually get buy-in from a group. So especially when there's deadlines to be had and these types of things. So one of the things with cross training, especially consultancies, like where the software cooperative is normally created very similar to a consultancy or law firm or something like that, where people are voting, there's a strong bias for individual metrics. So if someone is getting or banging out work items, things that are highly visible, but are unique to one person, it seems like they're doing a lot of work. Whereas you can have for the software cooperative or for the customers 2 different issues there or concerns. There could be a business value that's separate from the individual. Right? So that right there is kind of the paradox that you run into, where it's kind of a mask for the incentives for cross training. So without actually looking a little bit deeper into your methods and processes, you probably won't see the incentives for cross training. You will probably just think or point towards some other reason why things are not being completed. They're staying in that last 10% phase. All right, so move down here a bit. So a big part of the Making Work Visible book is about the term that she uses in the book is time thieves. Right, so things that steal our time, these invisible habits that we have, or they're informal and unknown processes that we kind of fall into, they steal our time without us knowing. So a big part of that is, let's say, like work in process or work in progress, I should say, unplanned work, unknown dependencies, and like ambiguous priorities. These are all things that you kind of don't know that they're stealing your time and they creep up on you. And the idea is to try to make them visible. So at that point, you can just naturally start doing things to address them. Right? And so these are some of the constraints. Let's see on cross training. But before I get into that, are there any questions so far? All right. So as far as the fundamental principle and kind of rule around, let's say, cross training, or why we don't cross train, but the kind of the thesis here is that the incentives are invisible. So, if the incentives are invisible, the things that steal our time, the things that require cross training, if those things are invisible, we won't allocate resources, we won't allocate time to address those problems with cross training, right? So although cross training could solve those problems, they are not visible, and so they don't go ahead and force us to do that, right? Let's see here. And I talk a little bit about T-shaped skills here. One of the things with T-shaped skills, they have your narrow side of the T. You can look at it as the vertical portion of the T. That would be your specialization. So it could be a certain style of programming, Unity programming, Ruby programming, something like that. The horizontal portion of the T would be something along the lines of like testing, some type of delivery methodology, continuous integration, maybe even gathering requirements and planning, doing work item planning, feature planning. All of those are things that go across specializations. When you are cross-trained, you learn those horizontal skills that will go across. You don't forego the specialization, you just add on. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So the incentives, in order to understand what the incentives are for cross-training, we got to talk a little bit about workflows from the time that a customer issues a request, right, to the time that that request is completely completed in their hands all the way. That would be a workflow. And there's different ways to describe workflows. A Kanban and the flow that Kanban has on a Kanban board is a way to model the workflow and make it visible for everyone. So you have to do, doing, blocked, and done, and these types of things. Within the continuous delivery book, they try to talk about or model workflows in another way, talking about, say, customer requests. So they call that a value stream. Value stream is kind of an all-encompassing method or process that goes all the way, has nothing to do with software, goes all the way from the time a customer says, I want this, to the time you give it to them. So within that, you have, since we're talking about software, you have something called a pipeline, which models the point from where, say, a developer checks in the code to the time that the finished working code gets in front of whoever's requesting it. So QA, developers, customers, power users, those types of things, people. So that is important because, say, the way that we model all three of these have a way of addressing, let's say, blockers and bottlenecks. And so I've noticed that they have different language for talking about the bottlenecks, but they're all interested in wasted time because of bottlenecks. So pipelines and value streams, they're about, and even Kanban, one way to get to like maybe a nirvana is to have this pull system where you have different teams or different individuals where they can actually pull things off of the queue. And so they're not waiting for someone to give them work, right? So all of this bottlenecks and blockers are at a high level. Those are the things that are incentives for the cross training. We're going to dive into that a little bit, right? So the first thing that is, well, first, do you have any questions so far?
No, a lot of observations. Like those I've soaked up there.
I missed that. I'm sorry.
Basically, I'm saying I may have comments later because this relates to a lot of ideas that I have from my own experience. But I'll wait to see more info before I throw those in.
Cool. All right. So too much work in process. The author of the Making Work Visible book calls this the ringleader of all time thieves. So they're all related to this one in some way. So too much work in process is kind of counterintuitive. It definitely was to me when I started reading. There's a bunch of literature on this subject where you have kind of some type of pipeline or workflow. You know, think of it as assembly line or whatever. And there can be a bunch of places where there can be constraints or bottlenecks, and the you know, someone off the street would just think, hey, you know, just try to ramp up every single station, every single place that you can as much as possible, and you know, that will be the best that you can do. There is a, you know, so the counterintuitive way to look at it, but the way that I guess assembly lines and Toyota, lean groups, and a bunch of these people, they have different ways of looking at it, but it's kind of very all related and very similar, is to, you know, figure out where your constraint is and then put buffers around it and don't have too much work in process. And the different flows like Kanban and Scrum and, you know, lean and the original theories of constraints, they try to solve it in different ways, but they all talk about work in process, progress in some way. They have different language for it though. But there is some kind of stop the work on in different areas, right? So don't have too much sitting because it causes distractions. In a literal assembly line, you have different stations. You have too much stuff. You can't even just, there's too much stuff piled up. You can't get around it in order to get to the station. I mean, something as simple as that to within software, which is counterintuitive to me, but I think is true. Just having too much work in progress, there's a lot of shiny things hanging around that you might jump over to. And you know, if your priorities aren't really strong and other things, you might actually get distracted by them. But just having too much work in progress can cause issues. Let's see here. Context switching and all kinds of other things happen too. So regular, I mean, just to go to expound on a little bit more, we were just at a conference where one of the developers, like a lead developer on the open source software called OpenStack, he was talking about how he wants to have the queue completely full for himself and other developers at all times, right? And so you want to switch from one thing to another as quickly as possible and these types of things. And OpenStack is completely democratized, like run as a democracy type organization is what he was saying, at least. So people are going to work on whatever they want. So the priorities aren't very strong there because you just can't force somebody. But that work in progress and context switching, he didn't really care so much about that. But within all this literature, that would be a red flag as far as getting high priority things done. So let's see here. Unknown dependencies.
I think people pointed for that one that y'all are a very special case where they had a lot of wait time. So they wanted enough items so that when they're waiting for something to complete, they could switch to something else and go on that.
Yeah, that's so if I were taking the stance of, the making work visible, theory of constraints, people and all that, you have a lot of wait time, and that's a bad thing. You have certain things that should be high priority that you just simply aren't doing. So if you were to say OpenStack's a competitor to Kubernetes or some other thing, well, that's why they get their lunch eaten by these other groups, because they're not doing their priorities. But they have a hard problem because everybody's a volunteer. So what are you going to do?
Yep.
There's probably something you can do, but what are you going to do? Let's see here. Unknown dependencies. This one is kind of counterintuitive to me as well. Right. So if you have dependencies on your code, so let's say you got a microservice and it depends on another microservice, and you think it's just going to work, but it doesn't. Right? It's already in production, but guess what? It doesn't work for you for whatever reason. There's some little change that has to happen or something like that. Those are, you'll run in, that's a blocker. And let's say that problem is an integration problem. Okay. So you need to call it with some type of security flag or something weird. Okay. The person who is an expert at integrating, right? So the person, most likely somebody who's on that team of the microservice or this other component, that person, you won't even know until it's time to deploy your work or deliver your work that you were dependent on them. Okay, and so that's just one case within the world now where everyone's trying to do things as a microservice. You can have many cases like that. So you have lots and lots of unknown dependencies. Right? Some things that you might kind of have an idea of, and some that you don't. Could be red tape. It might not even be, software related. All of that, those unknown dependencies, for each unknown dependency, it can double the chance of you being delayed or late, right? And we're going to talk about it, but getting an incentive for cross-training, if you're going to run into the same type of microservices over and over again, someone, when you get blocked and that other person starts to work on it and you're there, and we're going to talk about this type of cross-training, but kind of being in the same room, observing them or whatever, that it's an incentive instead of, it's something that would normally, it does happen or can happen, but we don't actually label it as cross-training. And oftentimes some project manager or somebody will look over there and say, why are these three people fooling around? Or why are these two teams fooling around and spending days or a week or whatever on this work item, right? And that creates all kinds of issues. Like some people can break off and start doing other work items so they look like they completed something, right? So if the reason, the blocker and the bottleneck isn't visible, the incentive for the cross training won't be there. And it's incremental. It can't be like one shot and then now we know we need to cross train on everything. It would have to be this pain that's seen over and over again, and then people team up with others and watch them and observe them, that type of thing. Any questions on that one?
I can think of multiple anecdotes that definitely does jive with my experience doing mobile software publishing. Describing to a client the process of submitting to the Apple Store makes you sound like a crazy person.
Right.
If in your organization you had someone else who had at least gone through that process, then you'd have some backup on not being crazy in pointing out how many unexpected things come up when you're trying to publish.
You know all about that, don't you?
You know, I had it happen with the Google Store too. Turned out that Unity was using a slightly different version of the hash that was necessary to include with your upload. And it was a weird bug. It was obscure, involved internet searching. No one else in the company I was working for knew anything about Android publishing, so they were all waiting for me to figure out why this thing that should have just worked.
Yeah. Just works.
2 weeks later, then you get a response. It's rejected for another thing.
Yeah, well, and then the next one you do, everything just works. And so that changes the expectations against your favor.
Right. All right. So the next issue, or invisible time thief, is priorities. So ambiguous prioritization or prioritization methods, right? They'll incentivize people to add their own personal work in progress in the order of their choosing. So if, let's say let's use that example. It's time to deploy to the App Store. Okay, we got blocked because some bureaucracy thing. Okay, we're waiting on this person to give us a call or something like that, or some type of tweak, right? That why they rejected it or something. What people do is go ahead and look at the queue, and if things, so we're talking about prioritization, if there isn't another priority that is number 2, very strong, and a work in progress already, and all this other stuff, people will go ahead and switch to whatever they want. So they might do some side project. They might do something that was in the queue, but it hasn't been started yet. There's all types of things. And so they're creating a work in progress, which we already said is something just by itself can cause an issue, right? And it's like I said, with the OpenStack guy and, other situations, I've done this myself, it will, can cause chaos, right? So instead of saying, I'm going to pick up the phone and call the second person that knows how to deploy to the App Store, I'm going to keep it blocked because I already called the first person who knows how to get into the App Store. I'm going to go ahead and move to something else, right? So the incentives would be for cross-training is, if we're blocked, who has already moved this into the App Store before? Get them on the phone. What's going on? So me not knowing, right? I know one way to get through, but I don't know the second way to get it. And there could be another person to call, could be some tricks of the trade or whatever. And so we might end up, 2, 3 people or teams, 2 teams on the phone or whatever, sitting there and working on this thing that seems like, because it's the very end, like the last 10% of a project, it could be high visibility, but for some reason, something in the back of our head says, well, it's just a little bit of work. It's already almost done. Why should I do this? I should do something else, because it's like all of us sitting on the phone or whatever that you're doing. So and we'll talk about it later, but there's this way of thinking of individual work versus business value. And it could be very high profile business value of getting something in the App Store, this new feature. But when you're not there all the time in front of some executive or some customer or whatever, you kind of hear that it's the high priority, but you don't really internalize it, right? So it could be like, so you have priorities 1, 2, and 3, like 1 to 10, right? You have 10 work items or 5 work items, let's say, and they're in order 1 through 5. It could be that work item 1 on a scale of 1 to 10 is a 10, and work item 2 on a scale of 1 to 10 is a 2. It's like in no ways anywhere near as important. You used to spend all day staring at the screen trying to get number 1, the first work item done before you do the second, because the second basically is almost meaningless. But you kind of don't internalize that unless you're in front of people who are saying this all the time. So that's when you have ambiguous priorities, which really is, there can be ambiguous priorities just not set properly. They're whimsically made, or it could be they were made well, but they weren't communicated well. Like just what I just said, like, how do you communicate that the first priority is really, really, really high, and the second one is like, I don't know, like I just did, like a scale of 1 to 10 is the only thing I can think off the top of my head, but it doesn't get internalized, and we just think, priority 1 is priority 1, priority 2 is priority 2. So you have that, and then you have the methods. Like I said, some priorities can be whimsically made. The customer could be someone who changes their mind every 5 seconds. So that alone will make like priorities not like in the minds of the people who are accomplishing them not very strong. Like we won't care. And then there's other prioritization methods. So like we were talking about from the Make It Work Visible book, you've got things like the highest paid person, present is the one that sets the priorities, or first in, first out, or like lowest hanging fruit, the lowest important hanging fruit, these types of things. When we don't know what it is, that's also something that makes it ambiguous. So all of that creates an excuse to go off and do whatever. But if you make it visible, so we had priority 1, you have all this political stuff behind it, high visibility, like as far as to the customers or something like that. And we're making it visible, like, oh, priority 1 has been in the queue for a month, and it requires these skills to get done, and it's in there for a month. Okay, well now there's incentive to, well, who has those skills? Oh, this person that's on vacation. Who has the skills? Oh, there's one person who has a massive work in progress, right? Oh, well, now you have incentive because it's visible and everyone can see it. You have incentive to cross-train with that person, sitting with them or whatever. And we'll talk about that later, about ways of types of cross-training. But that would be the incentive for it. But it's something that's normally hidden is the point. So anybody have questions on that one? We're all good?
Yeah, no questions. I feel it though. Many times.
Yeah. And so now we've got the T-shaped skills. When the causes for bottlenecks are made visible, cross-training becomes incentivized for the team, right? So we just talked about those other time thieves, let's say. And I mentioned this earlier. So as people could become cross-trained, they take on a new T-shaped skill set. The T-shaped skills forego narrow disciplinary skills or specializations, right? And then they move towards things that will, a broader set that deliver business value. Okay. Specializations could be something like programming in Ruby, like I said, Unity, whatever, or just DevOps or something. And then the broad set is an interesting thing there can be all kinds of broad sets, but the one that they're referred to would be the difference between the types of skill sets you find on a project team, which would be more specialized because they throw things over the wall towards people next in the stage of delivery, and people on a product team, right? So on a product team, everyone's responsible for developing, testing, delivering the product on the team all the way till it gets in the hands of the customer or whoever it is that asked for it, internal or external customer. So if they're responsible for all of it, they also are sharing all types of skill sets. That at least being aware of someone else's skill set is also cross training. So knowing what a QA person needs in order to get the job done is also cross training. The blockers that they have that they run into, right? But also you could be someone that can roll up their sleeves and move from one to another. So develop, test, or deliver these types of things. Any questions there?
Nope.
All right. All right. So the third book that I grabbed some information from is called CrossFunctional Teams. It's kind of a book it's an older book from 2000-ish, 1998-ish, when cross-functional teams started getting a little bit more publicity. One thing I found in there as far as learning within a cross-functional team was there was one study that was done on the cross-functional team on how they learn, and it said that there's 4 ways that they end up learning. So direct knowledge, skill transfer from other members, observing other members in action, engaging in team problem solving, and expanding prior experience, reframing new insights are the 4 different ways that they noted. None of those were formal training methods. None of those were go to a classroom or do an online course or any of those, as far as when it came to cross training. So they didn't say that it was impossible to do it that way, but that's what they found. So all these are all informal methods. Reminds me of stuff like pair programming if you're talking software, but it could be something as simple as sitting in Zoom, in front of a Zoom screen with 4 other people and bang your head against the wall, trying to get that one high priority work item out the door. And having the one person that knows how to do it, speak while they're doing it, you're observing them, things like that. So we're familiar with doing this. We just don't call it cross training normally, right? So what do you guys think about that definition?
It made me think of it made me think, oh, maybe that's why people in training sessions, even that are called that, do the role-playing thing, because that's more of those 4 things there, the informal things that get across. Maybe they don't know why they're doing it that way, but those are good reasons why you would choose to be goofy and act something out instead of just talk about it.
You may have someone do an overview and then they go, now get together and group.
Right, and then you learn things all over again
that
you didn't pick up.
Yeah, I think we do this ourselves every week on all sorts of stuff. And we try to use a lot of tools like the screen sharing Zoom and other stuff, do a lot of pair programming. And it goes across the board. We had to do some booking for business travel and having issues with different sites. And we actually did something similar for that. We was like, okay, this seems to be working. Go in incognito, go click here. And so I was like, okay, I did this. All of those kind of tie in. But I like the informal, just trying to share those ideas, encouraging sharing.
Well, one risk is possibly that so much of this is stuff that we do, we might say, well, obviously, and then go back and not do it. Because it's easy to go heads down when you hit something critical in a project. and forget to be visible and
Yeah.
let everybody else help you work on it. Also reminds me of that system that flight crews on airplanes use. The one that they switched to so that stewardesses wouldn't be afraid to tell the captain something that he ought to have noticed. They formally use that now. Like, they are, honest to goodness, supposed to interrupt the captain despite rank and all of that and say, well, I guess, but the thing I was going to say is one of the ideas here to make this one of the formal things that you have as a goal so that you don't forget to do it, since maybe some people naturally do it, others don't, but if it's one of the ideas that you focus on as your organization, I guess I would call it you have a mission objective and you have a mission statement, you have mission objectives. It might be one of those.
Making things more visible, right? It's like Kanban boards, but there's other types of things. So like, say, an aging report that's posted right where everyone can see it all the time. I guess is a bit more difficult when everyone's distributed, but you know how you do that type of thing. So aging report, oh, these things were sitting around for a month, right? Those are I guess the point for that book is there's methods for solving, and they didn't really just say cross training is a way to solve everything. You know, it's just something that I honed in on, but making everything visible and making the pain visible is the first step, and then you naturally, and I'll say organically, will come up with things to solve it. Cross training being one, but that's what I think would be. I just don't know as far as the distributed teams. You know, once you log into Zoom, you have some type of thing that pops up. I don't know.
Trello plus Slack.
Yeah, and that's another thing in the book is she's not very hot on the electronic style because
it depends on how you use it. It can be used badly, of course.
Yeah.
If you're distributed, it's hard to do much of anything else. You got to figure that out.
Right.
One thing that you asked, Matt, was how do you keep people doing this sort of thing if you have something critical? So something's on fire or really important, then someone just drops off and they're like, yeah, well, I'll get back and we'll do that after I get done with this. I think the first part is to keep making it visible, what we're saying, as the habit, and making that safe to make things visible.
I was going to say that, yes.
Once you have it safe, then it makes it a lot easier to have that roll forward. And I'm for trying to make it visible and use this, like, bring people in. If you're planning on having someone be a part of pairing or whatever you're going to do, even if it's something really complicated and important, doesn't mean that they can't be there and watch, you know, in some fashion.
Okay.
We may not be able to slow everything down and go, okay, this is 2 weeks of training for you to understand it. We'll spread it that long, but you can give some information.
Yeah, we're all pattern recognizers. You
Yeah.
can just say, why'd you do that differently? And that might be the key.
It may come up, and that may expand the time a little bit. I think sometimes we've even doubled the time on something, but then that's reused the next time. It always pays off. And even on, like, on fire things, we've been doing pairing enough where I will call people to get on, or I'm going to jump on, even if it's just to see what's going there. And there's always, if it's on fire, there's probably something that we're going to miss because we're so focused on putting that out. We're like, don't forget this other thing, or we're going to have something else. And that's really come because of just the habit of having everyone okay with pairing and seeing what's going on. It's okay that you're going to mess up.
Yeah.
Software.
It requires a lot of bravery.
Yeah.
Because doing this really well on an individual basis at a large company can get you fired.
Yes.
So let me say this, again, in that Making Work Visible book, in the very, the back portion, she describes something called individual swim lanes, and it's kind of like a anti-pattern. So if you have some type of board or something that shows a human in their name and then the work items that are assigned to them, then it's broken. You're supposed to do something like, you could do something that says skill sets, right? So, continuous delivery skill set and all the work items under that, development skill set or whatever, maybe languages or whatever. And when those skill sets start showing bottlenecks, then you know you're supposed to do cross training for those skill sets. But if you do individual, you measure individual, then you have what I was saying earlier, individual, well, it's earlier in the paper, but individual metrics. So people will just say, oh yeah, I'm going to get 10 things done this week. But, you know, they might not be along the lines of the priorities or whatever. But it's easier to, you know, I'd say easier, but it's something that people will game if you do individual metrics. So she also calls it vanity metrics. So, so you can't, you know, there's a problem. That's a part of the book. It's just finding vanity metrics and finding things that people are measuring that have nothing to do with business value. They have to do with individual, like metrics for individual team or individual person, and eliminating them. Or, you know, if somebody, let me see, as examples of, say, an executive that says, I want to measure this, right? And they just put it up there. There's nothing you can do about it. But then you have another one that says, okay, we're going to also show, like I said earlier, metrics by skill set. And so you can see, it's not the individual, it's continuous. The DevOps stuff is just slow, right? So, yeah. All right. So, I mean, in conclusion here, I'm just read this here. Cross training is needed when work items are demonstrably blocked repeatedly. Okay. So you can demonstrate that, and you've got the incentives so you can get the buy-in and all that. We can demonstrate the need for cross training when we make the processes that lead to wait times and blockers visible. And cross training is needed in order to address too much work in progress, unknown dependencies, and unclear priorities properly. And we shouldn't discount the need for informal training, even if it doesn't seem as valuable as the formal training at the first glance. So, any final questions, comments?
I can say that at the housing co-op where I live, I don't think we've written this down, but cross-training is just implied as how we govern ourselves. All of we're run from the bottom up. It's natural that you want people to specialize and focus on a particular thing, and so they become officers and they have an area of responsibility. But the terms are very short, and we have elections, and it's generally expected that anyone in the house, and there's 25 people, anyone in the house can do any of the jobs, not necessarily well, but we can say, it's your turn, you wear this hat today, and they'd be able to do it because they've seen it, and because the process of stumbling through it means they create artifacts that make it more visible to the next person that comes in what to do.
They find value in it.
And
Appreciate when others are working on it.
And another example is we label everything in the kitchen. It's not something you do in your own house. You'd feel ridiculous. You know, you don't measure, you don't mark where the blender goes. But if you have just one more person involved, then where the blender goes is now something abstract that you don't own. You have to, has to be knowledge that's shared. So I like to externalize. Put something outside of any one person's head. Anyone can discover it, anyone can use it.
We do that in cases where there is a fire, there's an emergency, and things move fast, and we get it fixed quickly. Mm-hmm. After we get it fixed quickly, we have a call. That was rough. You guys okay? So what happened? What do you think caused it? What did we have to do to fix it? Like, so many things were happening. Who did what? What even happened? Sometimes it was we fixed it. Sometimes it was an external party that fixed it. And then it's, how can we, well, that was really painful. Is there any way we can try to avoid to do that again? So that was just the whole morning. It was a whole Monday morning usually. I don't know why.
Yeah.
We don't want to do this every Monday morning. What can we do to not do this every Monday morning?
And
then
not
we'll
have just one person that knows how to fix it.
exactly. Yeah. So then we write something up. It's pretty informal, and it's pretty much like under the guise of, not under the guise of like, everyone made a mistake, you know, we're all fired. But it's like, yeah, that wasn't fun.
Yeah, in a post-mortem sort of structure, everyone's encouraged to come up with examples of things they did wrong or things that didn't work.
Yeah. So that becomes an artifact, as you're saying. Like, okay, that just happened. We all suffered through it. Let's learn from it and have something documented and written and saved so that we can say, hey, this sounds a lot familiar with what we had to do. Let's go back to that write-up or whatever, however you want to remember it. And another point, I like to work in teams that are collaborative and are willing to share knowledge. That's where I thrive, to be in a group of people who are open and willing to share what they know and also eager to learn more. And the thing that this combats for me is something that I don't like hearing is when someone would say, well, that's not my job. And that falls into like the project teams that do just their part and says, I did my part, I'm done. Not thinking about, okay, but as a consultancy, the group doesn't get paid until the customer's happy. So just because this one part is done doesn't mean the customer's happy you did that part. The customer will be happy when the whole team delivers the product. And so being cross-trained takes away some of that individual feeling of like, my job here is done, I'm gonna break, when like it's on fire and someone else has to deal with it. Promote the cross-training to help the group.
I like the visibility that Weston was talking about. So you want everyone on the team to know that it's important, why they're doing it, not just to get done with this, but that way they have buy-in across the board. And I think they get that with cross-training.
On the flip side of that, I would say that cross-training is something that you can surreptitiously create a space in which it happens for the people you're working with without asking them to do something or asking them to even understand that they're cross-training.
Yeah.
You can just make everything visible. Example from my work is most of all my work has been remote, and we use portals or tools like Slack. Artifacts are created, are uploaded to a shared space. Most of the work that you do is visible electronically in some form. Like there are vibrations of the things you create, and people kind of have an idea of what you've been doing by just how often you come on to chat and what things you say and so on. So yeah, just by getting all of your team to use one communication medium, you can get some of those 4 informal cross-training points. Yeah, that's good.
Even reading through commits in GitHub, you can cross-train. Oh, how did they do this?
I love those, yes. I like things that create footprints that you can sort of, it tells a story, which is interesting. And a good way to teach someone something is to have them be interested in it.
Yeah.
A good way to do that is for it to be interesting. And visibility is a way that things can be more interesting.
Yeah.
All right, guys. We're running into about an hour, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the broadcast now.